Thank you, Ravi, for coming.
Yes, thank you very much. Am I the last speaker?
No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Looks like it. Or Darryl always give me as a last speaker because if you give me first, by midday I will be missing from the conference. So I think it was a strategic move to keep me in the vicinity. Okay, good evening everybody. My name is Ravi from Malaysia. Let me get my glasses, just a second. Alright, the topic that I'll be speaking to today is on development ethics, which is the theme of the conference. From a S&T policy perspective in Malaysia, from the science and technology perspective, in Malaysia we have three components, which is science, technology and innovation. But basically I do not have any major argument that I'd like to set forth. I think it is just a descriptive presentation about how the idea of ethics is enshrined and developed within the S&T policies in the country. Now I got a special interest in this because we have a policy called the National S&T Policy version 2, and I was prior to me becoming an academic, I was a bureaucrat in the science ministry. And I was for 2 years I was doing this work, which was not very interesting though. Sometimes our policy work in the ministry. Right. My name is Ravi. I teach at the UKM, which is the National University in Malaysia. I teach international relations. That's my area of specialization. Okay. Basically, I'm going to talk to you for about 15-20 minutes. This is my organization of my presentation. I'm going to look at what scholars have to say about the idea of the concept of development ethics. That will be followed by the overview of development ethics in Malaysia with regard to the science and technology sector, especially with the policy planning. And I would also would like a third part of the presentation. I would like to highlight some of the principles of societal norms and ethics, which appears repeatedly in the text itself. Alright, defining development ethics. I think the previous presenters, several previous presenters, we have looked at the idea of what is development ethics. Again, I'm looking at some of the definitions. Development ethics are usually defined as how aspects such as human rights, basic needs, and the concept of social justice is enshrined and achieved during the process or the final outcome of a development project. It can be in a mental state and also can be at a deliverable state where the concept of ethics is enshrined in the process of development. It can be economic development or it can be infrastructure development. It can also be on socio-cultural development as well. Now, the evolution of development ethics, it came about, if you look at the literature of development ethics, much of the idea of development and ethics came about after the Second World War. There was relative peace, or there is in fact now, after the Second World War, and the opportunity or the possibility of an all-out war has been greatly reduced by the emergence of a multilateral system like the United Nations. So therefore, countries, newly independent countries, newly decolonized countries were looking at the idea of development. Right? Many of the countries have developed. I think the last 50 or 60 years we have seen significant socio-economic development in all parts of the world. However, when we talk about development, there was not really, when we started in the 1940s and 50s, there was not really a concept of ethics in development. Everybody was pushing towards economic development, poverty alleviation, all right, making as much money as can, business opportunities, And so these are the things that that was the mainstay of the discourse, development discourse at that point in time. Array of organized activities, development measured by high national income. So therefore, whatever when we talk about development, we always talk about in terms of gross domestic product, GDP. We talk about all the other economic indicators to show that we are doing better economically, and that has been the key indicators for us to gauge the level of development, which may not be very accurate. This has also brought about some level of cultural changes as well. I just give you the example here. I just put the example. The cows must now be defined as nutritional resources, right? Not as sacred being shielded for human consumption. Alright? So everything has a utility. Alright? Everything has a utility. An economic process has a utility. As an object has a utility for the benefit of human existence. Alright? For the benefit of human existence. Forests and other natural resources also have a utility. For what benefit? For the benefit of human existence, and also for the benefit of consumption. So we look at the last 50 or 60 years, mankind has been a consuming nation. We consume, alright? Sometimes we over-consume things. And because of this consumption pattern, we have a lot of issues of scarcity of resources at this point in time. It was self-evident that the economic development is everywhere and for everyone. A good thing, the concept of, economic development is essentially a good thing, which generally we all accept. And that technology must be harnessed for all human activities because it boosts productivity, right? So whenever we look at even the idea of human beings as a factor of production, right? So I think this is basically how it started, the idea of development. Then eventually, the ethics component came in. Okay, especially when we saw that the idea of development without ethics, we creates a lot of other issues as well. All right, socio-cultural issues of overdevelopment, that do not really address human needs, human rights, human security needs, and whatnot. Now, these are what some of the scholars have said about how you look at development ethics. Okay, John Rawls says that the successful execution of a rational plan of life, okay, by which the person determines the good for himself and to herself, right? Meaning which you can also have a concept of development ethics on your own, say which is good for me. Of course, it must be ethical as well. Alright, but which is good for me? It may not be good for the whole community or for the country, but it can be also good for me because it addresses my concerns, not only my socio-economic concerns, but also my spiritual and ethical concerns as well. Again, there are other things, other thinkers that look at the concept of human, right? What human person are flourishing means that their lives are good, worthwhile in the broadest sense. So the concept of ethics slowly merging into the idea of development that is to the development that benefits the people, that benefits the humankind and its habitat. Now there is another, scholar who mentioned about this idea of development or views development not only from the perspective of growth, which I mentioned earlier, but also in the concept of well-being. Right? Now, I would like to emphasize the idea of well-being because the science policy of Malaysia have also the concept of well-being. For several years when I was in the ministry, we always talk about well-being, science and technology, creation, whatever creation, invention, whatnot, must be for the well-being of people, right? But my argument, which I would like to make later, is that concept of well-being is not really quantifiable. You can't really see, in what sense that the SNT policy has contributed to the well-being. Of course, indirectly, but I don't think there's any research to quantify that. Alright? It talks about qualitative enrichment of human being. Alright? And also the other one talks about ideals and values. The other one is Godet, and this is a very famous scholar who speaks a lot about development ethics, or the leading scholar in that field. He summarizes it as debates over economic and social development into the area of ethical values. Okay? Now he comes up with these two concepts of end state and as an end means, meaning which the processes also, you need to take into account the processes as well. Not only the end game, but also the processes as well. So the ethical elements or the ethical consideration must also come in the whole process of development. Not only the end part of it, but also the initial part, the thinking part, the formulation, the conception, and also the processes, the activities that we carried out. Okay. Now, these are some of the things, the principle of development ethics. All right. Now, whenever we talk about development ethics as a policy, when I was in the ministry as a bureaucrat, the first thing that we were trained, we have to undergo a postgraduate diploma on public management, right? So the first thing that we look at when we talk about public management is when we come up with a policy, there's a principle of greater good. Whatever policy that we constitute, there must be a principle. That is a primary principle. Of course, there are other considerations as well. So again, the idea of development, I think, must also serve the idea of greater good for the stakeholders, not only for the stakeholders, but also for the recipients or for the people. Now, of course, there is also ethics as rules and ethics as principle motivation. Now, sometimes you find that the ethics is imposed. Alright, ethics is imposed, but whenever in many situations of development, when there is a what you call that problem in implementation or on enforcement, you find that people tend to not to follow rules. Alright, so I think if the ethics is a principle motivation, meaning which it comes from within, it's inculcated. So therefore, then people will have self-restraint or will have consideration, in order for them to act ethically in their life. I'll just give you an example. What stops you from throwing rubbish out of your car while you are driving the highway? What stops you? The policeman maybe. There is a rule. If you get caught, the window stops you. That's what we do. We compare with Singaporeans. In Singapore, you're not supposed to litter. You're not supposed to spit. All right, but not all. But some Singaporeans, when they come over to Malaysia, they start doing all that.
Really? Oh my God!
A lot of traffic summons because they can't drive fast. A lot of traffic
They're
summons.
compensating.
So there you are actually. I mean, I'm not sure whether it is a principal motivation. It is because there is a punitive repercussion, right? So you need to behave accordingly or ethically in that sense. All right. Then there is also a debate when we talk about development ethics within development and also under development. All right. The concept of equality that everybody in a particular community or a country requires some level of development for them to progress. Like for example. Now Malaysia has come up with this concept of equal development, meaning which if you go to Kuala Lumpur or you go to another state or another rural area, pretty much the basic amenities you'll get. The schools will be there, electricity will be there and all that. But in certain countries and all that, the development are based. That's a different model of development. Deng Xiaoping in China came up with this model of development. They said, we will develop the cities. So the cities, once you develop the city, the synergies within the city will develop the outside. I mean, development, philosophers may not, they may disagree with this particular concept. But you see, the whole idea of development that who has the right, to benefit from the development, that's another question here. Of course, when we talk about development ethics, there's always an idea of justice, right? whether the development or the activities of development is harming certain people, right? Their rights, their positions, and need to be heard, right? And their queries need to be heard as well. Of course, there are either the concept of human freedom, human rights, which we can talk about this, right? So basically, I've underlined about 5 here in blue: development for what and for who. All right, that's primarily number 1. Is it for only economic interest? There's one incident in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. They are breaking down flats. All right, they were low-cost flats. These are actually people who are artisans and all that. Now they want to break down the flats because they want to build another shopping center. And these people are going to be moved to another place. Okay? Now, one of my friends lived in that place, and one of the concerns they raised was, these people, they say that development, the city has already expanded, so therefore this is area for development, you guys have to move on. Fine. But do we need another supermarket? Do we need to have another mall? There are so many malls within the city, in the city. What is the need for another mall? It doesn't really serve the need. I mean, you have so many other malls. So the idea of participation and stakeholdership has been there as well. Now, development of meaning, who defines it? Who defines development? All right. How much is enough? This is another problem. Overdevelopment. All right. You have overdevelopment in some places. I'm not sure in Bangkok. I'm sure in Bangkok as well. No proper planning. Then what happens? You have congestions. You have low quality of living in terms of the sizes of houses.
Pollution, air pollution.
Yeah, air pollutions and things of that sort. Okay. Now, who is responsible for the development and why? Okay. And the trade-offs. Who are the losers? There's always whenever there is a development, there's always losers with that thing. Okay? The ideals that I'm going to look at is basically the idea of social justice, right, and care, and distributive justice, right, and the idea of civic virtues, doing what is right, right, and also transformative leadership here, meaning that development must be based on a certain level of leadership, and this leadership must be transformative, bringing about change to society. Okay, now, this is having briefly outlined the conceptual framework of human ethics. Now, this is Malaysia. For those of you who do not know, this is Thailand. We are somewhere here. All right. This is Malaysia. This is East Peninsular Malaysia, and this is East Malaysia. Peninsular Malaysia, East Malaysia. East Malaysia, we have 2 states, which is Sabah and Sarawak. These states are in the island of Borneo. Okay. All right. Okay. Now, just want to tell you about the national science policy here. We have a ministry called Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, and we have a policy and also an act, a parliamentary act to look at the science and policy of the country. Basically, the aspiration of the country is to become a nation which is competent, confident and innovative in harnessing and utilizing and advancing S&T towards achieving the goals of Vision 2020. We also have a Vision 2020, but now I don't think that we are going to follow the Vision 2020 because the Prime Minister who initiated the Vision 2020 is no longer favorable to the present government. Now we have come up with another policy, so I think probably soon we will be looking at another time frame for this policy.
2030?
Maybe.
Yes, that's the UN.
Right. Now, I've just extracted some portion, some extracts of the policy. Under the new direction of the second National Science and Technology Policy, essentially it talks about ensure that the utilization of the S&T accords emphasis towards approaches that are in conformity with sustainable development goals, including alignment to societal norms and ethics. I have underlined this word, societal norm and ethics. You see, the idea of societal norms, acceptable norms and ethics appears 4 times in the policy. Right? The second, and this is the first time it appeared. The second part that it appeared is on the operating principles in the S&T development under the bracket, under the subtitle of community. Enhance and support enhance, support and active participation of the community in SNT development relevant to their daily lives and in accordance to acceptable norms and ethics. Relevant to their daily life, again, acceptable norms. We'll look at what is acceptable norms. Okay? Because the policy did not really elaborate on what is acceptable norms. Correct? Then under the strengthening of institutional framework and management of the SNT and monitoring of the SNT policy, it also talks about this. These issues have to be addressed. Right? What are the issues? These are the issues. Right? New technologies and whatnot. Okay? Rapid advances in new technology, especially in the field of genetics, right? Raising serious moral and ethical concerns, right? And these issues have to be addressed in consonant with acceptable norms and ethics. The other one, it looks at another section called specific initiatives. It also talks about, again, preventive approaches as well as being consistent with the acceptable societal norms and ethics. Now, what is acceptable societal norm and ethics? In order for us to understand what is acceptable in the Malaysian context, we need to know the social-political fabrics of the country. Now, this is my mind because to my mind I've listed a few, and I will explain to you what are acceptable norms and ethics. Now, when we talk about societal norm and ethics, okay, that primarily has to be that are not against Islamic value system and beliefs. Okay? Islamic value system and beliefs. This is what we call acceptable. Okay? It is not something which is written or stated anywhere, but it is given. Right? It is given. Okay. Then the second criteria will be societal norms and ethics that are aligned with the culture of the indigenous people, the majority of which are the Malay people, right? So, culture, right? Okay, number 2. Number 3 are societal norms and ethics that are palatable to the public at large, all right? Palatable to the public at large, meaning it is not too much against everybody, okay? That's palatable. Then you have societal norms and ethics acceptable to general scientists, the scientific community, what they look at. Now, this is essentially how the fabric of acceptable societal norms. Now, we can argue what is acceptable to you may not be acceptable to me. Right? I may have a different point of view, although we are in the same religion or value system or faith system. Or we may have different sets of belief, but like killing or suicide, as we talked about just now, it is against the teaching of Islam and Christianity, probably. But it may not, if I am a Jain, right, which is a sect of offspring of Hinduism as well, it's not wrong. Okay? So what is acceptable to you, it may not be acceptable to another person who are also an equal stakeholder to the system. Alright? So the problem of this, I remember when I was there was not much of public debate in policy formulation. Okay? That's the issue. I think it's your main note. We don't really talk about there's not much of public interaction about what a policy should be, no, and identification, what are acceptable, not acceptable, and these are some of the major issues which is kind of reflected in the science and technology policy of the country. I'm going to stop there. This is more of an introduction to the system. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
I was hoping you'd say more.
Correct.
Just getting me, interested.
Yeah, we can talk about it.
It's open for questions and discussion. So
I know it's 5 o'clock, it's a bit difficult to keep.
No, we usually continue. We're going on to 8 o'clock. So
Of course.
If nobody wants to start, I can start.
Turn around so I can see on the video as well.
Oh, okay. When you were just saying your last, reading the last line,
Thank you.
and it's not, no, the one before that.
The one before that.
Yeah, can you go back to that slide? Because I thought that was the most interesting slide in the whole presentation, the last one.
Yeah,
So the first one, okay, yes. Second one, okay. Third one, okay. Fourth one, uh-oh. That's what my mind said. It seems to be oxymoronic, sorry for the term, or contradiction to everything above it. Because as philosophers of science, we know from training, most of us would probably agree that science tends to be based on principles that usually is in conflict with revelation, all the revelation, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, because revelation is immutable, unchangeable, undebatable. You accept it on faith and story, where the principles of science are subject to debate, and debate after debate after debate, it changes, it's cumulative, it's got to be validated, it's got to be made reliable, tested again and again and again and again ad infinitum. So the two essentially are two, distinct systems. Yeah. Sometimes they may merge and agree on an issue or two, but by and large they're really two different animals. I'm not saying one is better than the other or one is supreme over the other. No. Personally, I believe they're both equal and they're both wonderful and they should be both protected even. But they're different. They're two different animals. So, when I see that line at the bottom in the same page as everything above it, which is immutable, then it says, uh-oh, here's something that's going to make life difficult for me as a scientist if I'm going to comply with this. It means, by definition, I'm going to be...
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good, interesting. I'd like to highlight here, I listed this in terms of priority. So as the list goes down, the priority is less. So that's the reason I put, having institutional knowledge about living in Malaysia, about the 50 years, I know, basically the discourse, which is open and as well as manifest and latent kind of discourse that appears there. The idea of religiosity factors in all aspects of life, or almost all aspects of life, whether it's direct or indirect in that sense. And the science and technology can be a bit contentious as well. You see, the idea of genes, genetic, issues of transplantation, issues of human body, issues of euthanasia, these are some of the issues that it's not open for discussion. People don't discuss about it. I don't think in the bioethics committee as well, national, they discuss about this. There is no open discussion. There is no publication on it. I've not seen ever since. Anything like that. So the idea of discourse, the concept of discourse, to discuss this is not there. And there is a dominant, rhetoric that this is not supposed to be discussed or this is given there. Although sizable section of the population wants it to be discussed. Understand or not? Alright? So I think there's a lot of sanctions indirectly, right? And that makes it the idea of policy formulation. The first principle I was mentioning, the greater good, doesn't really reflect. Alright? It's not really reflected in that sense. So I think it's like, we understand, in the 1940s and 50s, when we talk about policy formulation, it always been state-centric. Alright? State-centric, they will tell you, this is good for you, so therefore this is the policy of the country. But over the years, it has changed. I think we are, in the case of Malaysia, there are changes happening nevertheless. I can't say it's not. But I think that on certain key issues which has some level of religiosity, then those issues are not touched. And to the detriment of the concept of discourse. So when there is lack of discourse, then people are not happy. There are some people who are not. So I think that's one of the issues that we have. I mean, in Southeast Asia, that's a normal problem. ASEAN, we are in ASEAN country, right? All right. Nobody. What is ASEAN? Now they have come up with this concept of community building in ASEAN. Wherever you go, the people are talking about community, and all that. Community for who? And ASEAN itself have not had this idea of opinion solicitation. They don't ask human people in the streets, what does community mean to you? Right? It's all, it's economic community, it's business coming together, and so on and so on. I think that is the problem that you find in Southeast Asia, and more relevant in Malaysia's context as well, because there's a lot of the concept of sensitivity is there because of different religions and whatnot. To my mind, I think that aspect of policy planning and discourse, it's a setback. It's a setback to the Malaysian system. That's fine.
Thank you. Very good answer.
I think. I think you missed out one more norms that probably is also relevant is the market and market ideology as a societal norm. Even though it's not said, but that is very prevalent in our country. Meaning to say, the market people are subjected to this idea of embracing. Just now, even you mentioned about consumer ideology. So I think that's quite prevalent in our discourse. And the second point I would like to raise is about this. How about this development of this plantation sector that has impacted these indigenous communities, particularly the Penang community or the Orang Asli? Their cultural rights are displaced as a result of this development of plantation sector that has encroached into these remote areas where these indigenous people reside. I mean, to me, that is one form of displacement. This displacement of indigenous community is one form of development ethics that has been impacted negatively.
You mean the Bumi Putra?
No, I'm talking about the Orang Asli, the Aboriginal people, as well as the natives in Sabah Sarawak, as a result of this oil palm development of this oil palm sector.
I think you've given the answer. You have mentioned about market forces and consumerism. We look at the Malaysian context, especially immediately after independence in 1957 up to 16. In the 1970s onwards, countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia were growing very rapidly, and we were, in fact, at one time was termed by the World Bank as the East Asian Tigers in terms of economic growth. So the concept of growth has always been market driven. It's always been about increasing the income of the people, the purchasing power parity, the rise of purchasing power parity, making money, the country's GDP. These are the things. And one of the problems that we had with that was actually fragmentation of plantations. The Indian community in Malaysia had that problem as well. When the British left, and they started selling the plantations, right? There was fragmentation. I mean, the plantation was sold off or totally. So a lot of people were actually working in the plantations, and they didn't have any other skills other than having rubber or agricultural skills. Now they don't have skills to fend for themselves. And that created ghettos and unemployment and all that. I think the idea in the 1950s, 60s and all that, the concept of ethics, the concept of human centeredness in policy wasn't there. People don't really talk about, is it going good for these people, or is it going to benefit these people? What's going to happen to these people who are now have to retool and reskill? We only talk about buildings and infrastructure. So it's more of an end game rather than the process itself. Okay, good.
Thank you, very interesting